Hello, welcome to Asia in Review. I'm Ellise Akazawa, and my guest today is Cristin Orr Shiffer. Cristin, thanks for joining me here.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're going to be talking about the role of women in Asia-Pacific security, and it's a topic that gets addressed. It's been getting some more media coverage than it has in the past, but it's definitely still an area worth exploring, and Cristin is going to be talking us through that today. So just for some background information for our viewers, tell us a little bit about your educational background.
Right. Well, I started a master's program. I'm reading for my, I finished the coursework and I'm about to finish my program. My background is in international relations and also in women's studies. So
okay.
A combination of both.
Okay, but you don't only focus on women's studies, you focus on a whole range of other issues.
Range of issues related to security, international relations, and women issue.
Okay, and then you're also a fellow at Pacific Forum. Tell me what that's like.
It's great. It's actually the ability to bring, we get to sit at the table with seniors in policy conferences and discussions, and it makes a big difference in terms of broadening your exposure and your perspective going from the academic realm to the policy practitioner realm.
Absolutely. So how long have you been a fellow at Pacific Forum now?
I started in January of this year.
Okay.
So about 3 months.
All right, well that sounds great. So let's get right into it. Why is it important to look at women as a level of analysis in international relations or foreign policy? Because I know for me, when I typically think of foreign policy, I think of countries or states or all sorts of different levels of analysis, but I don't naturally think of women as a way to view the international system.
Sure. Well, I think initially a lot of the research did focus on states as the primary actor internationally, and then eventually we kind of evolved from states to international organizations being another level of analysis. But as our world changes, as globalization and other aspects kind of come into play, what we end up having is a system where human security, or security based on everyone's experiences rather than just a state-centric experience, becomes more valid.
Okay, so when we talk about human security, we're really talking about an individual, the security of each person, as opposed to maintaining the security of the state or the government as a whole.
Right. Well, I think we know from recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that sometimes just because the state is experiencing more, I guess, security, perhaps from an American perspective, we're more secure. Where the threats are no longer there, say in Afghanistan, to the same extent that they were, but we have introduced a whole nother level of insecurity in terms of the relationships of human beings to water, to food, to rights. I think another perspective is also to look that, when international relations as a field was being developed, it was typically developed based on wars, by security having a very narrow description, instead of having a more broader, holistic definition that understands economic security, resource security. We see that a lot of conflicts these days are about resource allocation. They're not so much about interstate warfare in the same way that they used to be. A state goes to war with a state. Now we're seeing groups within states having conflicts. And so when we look at the level of analysis, what we really want to focus on is certainly states are probably still the most certainly they're still the most focused on actor, and they deserve all sorts of analysis, but it becomes more interesting and we get to more diverse ideas on how to address security when we actually start to say, well, what does everyone look like? Instead of looking at warfare, which is predominantly experienced and participated in, combatants typically tend to be men, what about the other 50% of the population? They experience warfare, and they tend to experience warfare differently. They may not be combatants, but that doesn't mean that when, security tends to mean for a male that the war is over or there's no more fighting. But for a woman, it tends to have more to do with freedom of movement, ability to access fields and markets, and to feel safe going about their day-to-day life. And so we have to take into account the other 50% that isn't necessarily participating in combat, although the caveat there is there are women typically that do participate in combat. But that the other side of the coin is also, how do we make sure that that 50% of the people who don't tend to be combatants are still experiencing security
I imagine that, you've laid out a great argument about why it's important to look at this, but I imagine that there might be some resistance, especially in a field that's as male-dominated as international affairs and foreign policy, that people might not see the value. How do you respond to those sorts of...
Sure, absolutely. I think that used to be the case. I don't think it's the case very much anymore. Certainly now in academic programs, there's a lot of emphasis on alternative forms of security. So it's definitely changing. Our militaries are now, UN Security Council passed Resolution 1325 in 2000, which had to do with recognizing the importance of women in security, in peacekeeping operations, in reintegration, and establishing long-term security. So I think it's coming along, and I think also in the military, in the U.S. military, certainly there is a more realistic or a pragmatic approach that says, budgets are shrinking, and if power is essentially the idea to get people to do what you want them to do, then why not look at ways other than simply using military force that gets that done? And so you get better outcomes, you get more accurate information. Your situational awareness in the field and in challenges becomes significantly improved when you stop looking just at men as combatants or young men or able-bodied men, and you start looking at the broader picture and you say, well, what's really going on here? It gives our commanders abilities to make decisions that are more holistically informed, and it also improves the impact of small projects to win hearts and minds, stuff like that. Take into account everyone. Don't say, do I need a well? Yes, we need a well. But ask, what happens when we build the well, where we build it? Does it impact the social relationships between people in that community? Does it impact the relationships between men and women in that community? Does disarming a bunch of men, but then not giving them a job, does that increase domestic violence? And when we disarm, do we also make sure to reintegrate women who have been alienated as well, to make sure that they receive the same benefits of demobilization that tend to accompany the former combatants? That's a big part of it.
So it really seems like like you said, it's a holistic view. I mean, looking at these unintended consequences and trying to find new ways of looking at these situations to see where the I guess sort of hidden consequences would be.
Sure. I mean, the idea is to look, instead of at just 50% of the population, to look at everyone. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's a particularly revolutionary view to say that you have to take a look at everyone in a population to make sure security. If you're only looking at 50% or even less than that, if you're only looking at the military side or who would be participating militarily in combat, then you're automatically assuming that all those other people are superfluous to any kinds of ideas of security. And we know that that's not the case. At the military level, our commanders know it. Certainly nationally, we know it. Yeah, state has big policies on that too. Hillary Clinton was a big one.
Absolutely. So we're talking about the role of women in Asia-Pacific security, but security can mean so many different things. And I mean, even within the literature, I feel that there isn't necessarily a consensus on what that term security really means. Would you mind talking us through sort of what we're talking about when we use the term security, whether there is a definition or there are multiple definitions?
Sure. Well, I don't think there is one definition of security. I mean, I think really what we know about security is that it's, the ability to kind of exercise your own autonomy individually, and then we talk about state security in terms of making sure to optimize kind of the system either internationally, but certain players in that system, in the international system, will have different views on what security is. Certainly, Iran right now has a very different idea of security than, say, the United States, or what is in their security interests. So it depends on what kinds of security, but at the end of the day, really, we could look at a human level and talk about the autonomy of the individual. At the state level, it's the freedom from fear of any sort of number of threats that then enable either people to live their lives or to states to follow their own practices.
Okay.
Yeah.
Typically for me, I think when I think about security, I think of military, tanks, warships, battles. That seems to me to be a much more traditional or conventional idea of security. So that's sort of, I guess, how I framed it. in my own mind for so long. But really, I guess there are so many other dimensions
Sure.
to the security picture.
I think military security is always the one people think of first. But at the same time, it can't be the only one. And I think our military is one of the first people that will say that, it's not always the military that is successful at doing long-term peacekeeping operations. We look towards the UN. We look towards other organizations that are better at creating peace on the ground. So when you have security of the military side that is, of fighting, but typically that's not the only side, and that might not be what needs to be done. Maybe what really needs to be done is, people need either jobs, or they need basic security, or they need to get rid of whoever's in power there that's been entrenched, and there needs to be an idea of better economic opportunities, better social opportunities. Military is a huge part of that, but they tend to be the first round, but then those other rounds, you can't keep fighting the same war over and over again. You need to put structures in place that keep the peace. And that's just as important part of security, perhaps maybe more important, and I think more important for our times right now going forward. It's not going to be about big wars. It's going to be about building security from the bottom up instead of just from the top down.
Okay, so let's jump right into what roles do women typically play in the security realm. I know that you and I had recently done a similar discussion at a girls' school, and some of the answers that we heard were surprising.
Sure. I think that the useful exercise to do there is to say, what do you think of women and, do a word association in your mind, women and international relations, or women and security. And the words you tend to come up with are words like nurses, or maybe diplomats, stenographers, I think, or typists was one of the ones that came up.
It's almost a throwback to hear some of these words, because, I think it really rings true, but in a way it's almost comical, because for you and I, we're in this industry, so we see obviously women in many different sorts of roles, but when you actually get out there and talk to the general public, particularly youth, which is almost even more troubling when you hear young women saying these sorts of things, that traditional women's roles would be stenographers, nurses.
Right. So I think what we're trying to do is suggest that there's a different narrative that can be presented in women in security. Instead of thinking of women as victims in wartime, of refugees, or of internally displaced persons, or as victims of rape, which is increasingly now a tool of war instead of just a byproduct of war. Instead of looking at women as victims, we look at women as agents. And if we start to look at them in those realms, then we can say, well, women are already doing things. I mean, unless people want to take the assumption that 50% of the population has absolutely no impact on the security of their country, or of the international system, then the assumption, or the explanation is already there, that women are doing something. It's just that it hasn't necessarily typically been identified as being in the security realm. And
that's a really key point, I think, especially because these roles are not necessarily visible, or the traditional sort of diplomat roles that one might associate with careers in IR.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the interesting ones, especially in Asia, is the idea of women as early warning systems for conflict. Women, not to essentialize or to suggest that women's roles are only in kind of these caregiving roles, but even within care work, we see women tend to know whether or not there are a lot of youth around that are kind of disgruntled, or if there are small arms caches, or what's going on. They tend to have the pulse on these kinds of goings on in their communities, but at the same time, for a very long time, typically, the militaries, or whoever the peacekeeping operators were, who have historically tended to be male, and it's never been suggested to them that this might be a useful area to find out. These women know what are going on, and so women now have become early warning indicators for conflicts in Mindanao, in Timor-Leste. So they're playing a role, but it just takes time to point it out. Sometimes we just it's not blaming men for it, but rather it's saying have you ever thought about this? If everybody who started to write about, international relations initially tended to be male and tended to focus on their lived experiences through security, then we get a very different perspective than saying, well, wait a minute, if 50% of the population is women, they're probably doing something, so what are they doing?
And I think that's a really key point that you hit on about men, is because so many times when I'm participating in these discussions, they tend to feel backed into a corner or blamed, and that's really not at all what this is about.
No, and the other thing is, men are also victims because of their gender. I mean, if we look at gender as, not the idea of biological sex, but kind of the traits that are associated in any given society with being male or being female. We know in peacekeeping operations for a long time, for example, in Bosnia, men or young men and boys were not protected initially, even though they might have been minorities and they were vulnerable. And some of the worst atrocities, Srebrenica is one of them, is men were killed in large numbers because peacekeepers were so focused on getting the women and the young children, women and girls out, that they left, the focus didn't shift onto these vulnerable populations. So the idea of bringing in, kind of a gender analysis isn't just about women. Gender shouldn't just be a code word for women. Gender should be about, right, and it should be about how these assigned assumptions that we put in, or characteristics in a society, impact the relationships between people. So now we know that it's important also to look at those male populations and to make sure we put in place procedures that protect them as well.
That's a really interesting outcome, and definitely not something that you would intuitively assume would be the result of sort of a women's or a methodology of looking at women. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about these invisible roles that women play, because I think that's fascinating. And you're right, that point really resonates with me about how you probably don't have 50% of the population who have no role in security whatsoever. They're there and they're playing a role, but what is that? And you mentioned early conflict or early warning systems. What else is there?
There are different, now women, especially in Southeast Asia, or in South Asia, but specifically in Southeast Asia, tend to come together across ethnicities, across religions, across groups, and will come together to try to do conflict mitigation, or to try to resolve conflict using things like education and microcredit initiatives. So the idea is that sometimes there are some portions of the population that tend to be incentivized to keep fighting. But there are other portions of the population, typically tend to be the women, who aren't the ones who experience security or safety within combat, the way that sometimes men are incentivized to keep fighting, because what happens at the end? Who's going to feed them? If the army's not feeding them anymore, who's going to feed them? What are they going home to? Women sometimes are incentivized to create these cross identities, whatever identities they are, religion, ethnicity, whatever the conflict tends to be around, come together across those tables and participate in peace building opportunities. I think microcredit is a good one too, that women will tend to come together around ideas of microcredit and development, and to try to support one another and recognize that together, high tide rises all ships, instead of just the idea that it's a zero-sum game.
So for anybody who might not be familiar with this, would you mind explaining microcredit or microfinance, just very briefly, sort of what is it?
Sure. So microcredit or microfinance is the idea that small sums of money given directly to women tend to have an exponential effect on development. So women typically, I think, the statistic that UN Women gives is 66% of the world's labor is performed by women. 50% of the food is raised by women or grown by women. Women are 10% of the leaders, and they own 1% of the wealth, or they have 1% of the wealth. So if you look at it from that perspective, then what you learn is that there's not a lot of money, either by structural reasons that women don't tend to own the land, or they don't tend to be the ones that own the equipment, the means of production to harvest the land. Then what you do is, if you can provide money directly to them, then you have increases in food security, you have increases in safety. You tend to see younger girls children of both sexes, but specifically young girls going to school at greater levels. When you see young girls going to school at greater levels, you tend to have more stability, you tend to have an economic growth. So, and we already know that economic growth and food security contribute to stability of that country. So these microfinance loans can be very small ways that security can, what the military would call, right, a force multiplier. I mean, it really, the idea is that these small injections of cash that are typically loans that are then, in sets of, as small as kind of 4 or 5 women that all are responsible. So they need to pay back the one loan before the next woman can get her portion of the money. So they need to work together. And if you're working together, that, you're not shooting each other. If there's an opportunity for people to have a better life and to feed their families, it's not always the case, but typically the case is if you think you're going to have a better life and you can put food on the table, there's a lot less incentive for you to go pick up a gun than say it is to say, all right, well, if your livelihood is tied to mine and we work together, then, we're probably going to, it's a sustainable piece or a sustainable security that militaries aren't necessarily always able to sustain.
I think that's really fascinating, and to me, especially the way that you've explained it, it seems like such a common sense solution to so many problems. And I'm wondering, is this a tool that either the U.S. government or foreign governments are using to increase stability at maybe the smaller, more grassroots level?
Sure. I mean, it's not, I don't want to present it as being overly rosy or simplistic. It's complicated. It's not to minimize the impact or the role of militaries. Certainly they're there and they perform a very important role. But the idea is to think in other ways outside of the box, to engage that 50% of the population that might not already be engaged. Yes, the United States is definitely interested in that. Secretary of State Clinton, former Secretary of State Clinton, when she would go to conferences overseas, one of the priorities was always to meet with women's groups or someone who was representing kind of a minority group or a women's group, local group, to listen, to hear what they had to say, to hear what their lived experiences of security are, because that then translates into policy. Because one of the things that we know is that one of the greatest barriers to increasing security, and especially increasing women's security or that of minority populations, is access to political leaders. So if you're at home trying to make sure that you've got enough food on the table, or that your children are taken care of, or you're worried about your ability to move freely in a society because of threats of violence, then you're not likely to be going out and advocating much on your own behalf.
Of course.
But if you can get those conversations between women and between those political leaders, then we know that tends to create new ideas, better thinking, better initiatives that are complementary to our traditional methods of security.
I just want to pause here very briefly and sort of interject. Do you ever come across people who say that there's a danger and that we're essentializing women? I feel that in some of the conversations I've had with women, other women have told me, well, I know so many women who are combative, who don't want to cooperate, who just because there's a kinship among women, that doesn't mean they feel a part of it. How do you respond to those people?
Well,
or those arguments?
Yeah, I mean, that is very much what we call, right, an essentialist argument. But I think the idea is not, personally from my perspective, not to push the women are more peaceable or peacemaking. I think there are sometimes incentives for women to be, because of where they are structurally within a society, whether or not that's a natural born trait or not, I'm not so sure. I think it might be more socialized. But even given that observation, I think instead of thinking about women as being more peaceable, maybe the useful thing is to think about the fact that the more equal opportunity we have for everyone, the less opportunity we have for conflict. So gender perspectives or any focus on women also tends to take into account, the whole idea of a gendered perspective also looks at things like race, ethnicity, class, where you are.
Class is a big one.
Right. So this whole idea of intersectionality, or this idea that there are many overlapping factors that all together create where people are or create their obstacles to realizing their full potential or to be where they are. And so the better things that we can do is to try to get away from all these structures and to try to just raise up the whole idea of equal opportunity. It doesn't mean that people come out equally at the end necessarily, but if you try to remove some of these barriers and you say, well, okay, do militaries always make it, environments safer? Iraq taught us that. I think of an example where there was a convoy of, I think it was German troops that were going by, and a gentleman, Iraqi, picked up his gun as the troops were going by. Well, to most military troops, an able-bodied man picking up a gun as you're driving by is a threat. Well, it turns out that what it really was his family was with him. And, so not all armed individuals are threats. And so to understand that militaries don't always equate to security is a very helpful way of thinking about how people in different locations experience security differently. So if we want to think about a holistic version of security, we have to understand these different perspectives.
I think it's fascinating. This whole concept for me is so interesting because it's just not something that we talk about, but I imagine that some of this might be controversial or might be resistant. I know that not everyone would agree that military doesn't mean security. So how do you respond?
I think military has a role in security, but I think most of our military members, and certainly our commanders, also tend to realize that they don't want to be there for the long haul. They're not capacity builders. They're not institution builders. They've been asked to be, but I think when you get to the heart of it, that's not what they're trained for, and that's not typically what they sign up for or what they ever imagined they would be doing, and they're not really equipped for. I think we've learned this with Iraq and Afghanistan, that some of the best things that we can do is let the military come in, let the military do what they need to do, but then also make sure that there are civilian organizations in place, or UN or multilateral, multinational, whatever you want to, organizations that would come in there and do the rebuilding, do the peacekeeping, do, the DDR, all of that stuff that needs to be done, the reintegration, the disarming, the demobilization, right? All of that tends to need to be done not just by military forces that can come in, but also by civilian forces that can supplement what they're doing. Military can provide security, but we don't have a lot of military that are trained in these things. We're getting much better at it, but this is not the traditional purview of our military. Yeah.
So we've talked a bit about states and militaries, but let's jump over to non-governmental organizations, NGOs, as well as intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs.
Sure.
What about women there? Do we see a little bit more visibility in leadership roles for women?
We do. Still not a whole lot. I think 9 out of 125 heads of state heads of state and are women. And we also tend to see organizations like UN Women, which is certainly very active right now. In fact, they just concluded, I think it was a convention on the status of women annual meeting this year, looking at domestic violence and how domestic violence impacts. But I think in international organizations, we have more of a push, but it also depends on, in organizations like the UN, they tend to work on consensus, right?
Yes.
So if we have states that are not so supportive of the role of women, or the idea that women are should be safe in their own homes, or that they shouldn't be subject to male control, those states tend to slow down the whole international process in a way that is challenging. So the idea is to try to understand that there are certain ideas that maybe need to continue to be reinforced, and not necessarily I don't know, I'm not even sure what the word would be for it, but the idea that states can't, a few states will definitely still slow down the whole international system is probably what I'm trying to say.
Got it. So let's jump back into the Asia Pacific and talk about sort of women's contributions there and those hidden roles. Back to the hidden roles again.
Yeah.
What about overseas workers?
Well, overseas workers are interesting. I think the Philippines is one country where the remittances constitute, I think, 13% of their GDP. So overseas remittances. So you see the typically Filipino women that are going overseas. They're working, but they tend to work in care industry, so they tend to work in home health care. They tend to work as domestic workers, and then they send remittances back. Those remittances then are buoying up the entire, or a large percentage of the Philippines economy. So when we see that, we see these kind of direct links between female workers who go overseas. And then the economic strength of their home countries in a way that I think isn't often mentioned, but is worth talking about.
That is very interesting. Are there any other hidden roles for women in the international?
Well, I think there are all sorts of ones. I think back to Cynthia Enloe, who's a international relations scholar who looks at the roles of people like diplomats' wives tend to be one that what about all the work that they tend to do that tends to be behind the scenes. But I think her analysis has indicated that most political decisions don't necessarily come in formal meetings, but they tend to come in these kinds of informal realms, and the facilitation and the support that women will do in those roles. Certainly in the military, you have a historical background of people who have been called, either camp followers or, nowadays it would be military spouses that do lots of work that then enables the military to operate in a similar fashion to the diplomats. These are all ideas that start to kind of question what it costs to fight a war. The other one that I think of, and I think that's really appropriate now, is the idea of the individuals who tend to care for the wounded warriors. So as our service members come back and they come back injured, typically, I read a survey that said it was on average 2 hours a night, 5 days a week, or 10 hours a week. I figured it out to be about 2 hours a night every work week, just in paperwork to keep the current level of benefits coming to veterans. So if you think about who's doing that, people are asked to, again, Cynthia Enloe writes about this idea that, mothers and spouses are asked to quit their jobs to come to support their sons and their husbands, and to try to help them through the healing process. But at the same time, we often see that there's very little, there's no support for them, really. It's an unpaid job that they're doing.
No support for the supporters.
Right. And so now there are more reports coming out that are suggesting, how do we do this? How do we combine public-private initiatives? What do we do to make sure that, we have more veterans are coming back wounded than have come back wounded, because we have such great medics and we have such great support. The military medicine has come leaps and bounds. So people who would have died are now coming back injured, but we don't have an infrastructure in place to support them. So we're again looking to spouses, to mothers, to kind of this care work. So if you look at what it really costs to fight a war, sometimes, I'm not saying don't fight the war, but I'm saying we really, as a culture, as a country, we need to be able to look at what is this going to cost long term, and what does this cost in lost productivity, or what does this cost? So it goes back to this idea of broadening the scope of what security means, whose work goes into security. That tends to give us a more holistic approach and a more realistic approach to what's going on.
I think it would be especially interesting, and I guess in many ways drives the point home, is if you take away that supporting role, what would the system look like then if you didn't have these supportive and caring, nurturing women, mothers, sisters, friends, to sort of help with that? It would look very different, I imagine.
It would. Or the other question, to put it in more pragmatic terms, is how much would it cost? If we had to pay for all of the care, if we had to pay for all of the kind of upkeeps of stuff that have mobilized troops of these, it comes down to being a cost issue a lot of times. So, loss of productivity, and the hidden kind of care work of what percentage of the U.S. GDP would be going to these things. That I think doesn't mean that we stop doing it, but it might be worth looking at how we think about it, or what the costs are, as we move forward, and certainly as America tries to kind of move forward with an idea of what is security going to look like in the future, because I don't think it's going to look like multiple, boots on the ground right now.
Sure.
I mean, I think we're definitely pulling back from that as a culture. The question is, what do we do moving forward? And so one of the best suggestions is to kind of galvanize these ideas. I mean, they're all kind of related. So let's look at the roles women play on the periphery of militaries. Let's look at roles that women play on the periphery of food security in developing countries. And when we start to put all of them together, we're not saying don't look at men. We're not saying look at men and suggest that somehow a zero-sum game, that like if women are increasing their equality, that somehow men's are decreasing. Right? So it's really important not to alienate the male populations, but to say, it makes sense for all of us together to kind of be working towards something that's a more holistic approach to security, and that's one that I think right now the taxpayers would be a lot happier with. It costs a lot less to provide aid or to make sure that that there's an education for young girls in developing countries, or to stem sex workers or sex trafficking. It makes more sense to do that, and that increases security. It's a lot cheaper than it is for us to deploy, combat brigade after combat brigade, to overseas. So we can look at it as a win-win situation. Doesn't mean men are being marginalized just because women are rising, and it also doesn't mean that we're losing, the impact of security, or we're lessening our security by looking at other avenues with which to pursue security agendas. Certainly there are some other ones that we can pursue that are more cost effective.
Absolutely. So in terms of this broadening the scope, I mean, just talking or hearing about the different things that you've been mentioning, new ways that we can look at things, new approaches, this seems like a huge task, and it almost seems overwhelming. But let's talk about some concrete ways that we can start sort of broadening that scope. Just small itty-bitty things that we can be doing to move the process forward. In South Korea, they just had the election of the first female head of state, and that was clearly a very big, visible win, and I know that many people were looking to that as an example of women's leadership. But what about smaller ways that we can start to broaden the scope?
Sure. I think it's a couple different things. One, it's broadening our definition of security. Two, it's looking for different perspectives on security. It's trying to include women, getting them access to political leaders, getting their voices heard. Some countries have gone the way of quotas, of representational quotas for women. So different countries will have, Rwanda, I think, has close to 50% now of their elected legislative leaders as females, because of the new post-conflict constitution. So the idea is we can do structural things like quotas, but we can also learn to incorporate, just NATO is a good example. NATO, not in Asia, but the idea of a gender perspective, that gender training. We have gender advisors now, and this is really helpful in terms of saying, okay, how do we look at, bringing women in, increasing the security in different ways. So structural ways, and then also kind of just practice ways. More women within the armed services certainly helps to sometimes bring about, not necessarily as they're serving in the military, but the military has always kind of conveyed a status later. It tends to be a springboard for leaders then become national leaders.
That's true. You do see a lot of our national leaders having come from military backgrounds.
Right. So while I would certainly argue that increasing the percentage of women in the military might help, the perhaps other kind of unintended consequence of that, or follow-on consequence, is that those women then have a better springboard to then become those national leaders. So you could go the route of quotas like some countries have, or you could say, well, there's a win-win for bringing people into the military too, because then they have that platform coming forward. They have more of a foreign policy or security experience. Our think tanks, our research organizations in Washington, I think CSIS in DC has 26% women, down to, I think Heritage has about 11%. It's the lowest. Those are kind of the most current numbers, and everybody else kind of follows them in between. But, you know, this is their senior policy people. This is not their support staff, but their policy people. So we kind of need to up those numbers too. I mean, if we can up those numbers, if we can up the number of people in those positions, both elected leaders, both military, and then our kind of intelligentsia, our thinkers, then if we bring those all together, then we definitely get an avenue where we're pushing more people forward, women, but also minorities. I mean, it's not just women. It's the idea, again, when we look at gender and we look at these things, is all sorts of people, not, you know, the ideas that diversity was probably, you know, it brings more people around the table, and it brings a broader perspective for problem solving.
Very, very interesting. How do we get more women to become interested in these positions? And the reason I'm asking you this is because when we did a high school discussion, some students had indicated, well, these are not careers that are interesting to me, and just because I am a woman and I want to be a nurse or in a caregiving profession, or if I do want to be a translator, I shouldn't feel badly about myself for that because it's my choice. So how do we encourage women to get into these positions? Is there a way to, I guess, tastefully do it?
I'm going to push back on the assertion that that women aren't already interested. I think there are a lot of women. I mean, if we look at the percentage of women who are university graduates just en masse, they're higher in the U.S. than men. So if we assume, you know, I mean, I think back to graduate school and, you know, it was at least 50% women, I'm going to say. Yeah, I mean, it was, so I mean, I think those women are there. It's just a question of how do we kind of keep them going, which, you know, I think kind of diverges from a security issue, becomes a little bit more of a social issue. But I think they're there. I just think that they're not necessarily always able for social reasons or you know, maybe even gender-based reasons, kind of expectations where they go. But I mean, I think that goes kind of beyond my scope of expertise and into kind of the social realm. But I'm going to say that those women are there. Okay. And yeah, and then that it's just, you know, I think time will be a big factor in it. Yeah, having these conversations.
Absolutely. And I mean, I just came back from a conference in San Francisco with the Pacific Forum Young Leaders Program, and one of the seminars that we did involved young leaders, so emerging experts, and it was great to see because it was pretty much 50-50 down the line, and we actually had someone make a comment about that, saying, wow, it's so great because you have a really great balance of men and women, and when you get the two at the table together, the outcomes will be richer.
Sure. And I think research also shows that when you have gender parity around tables, you tend to get women sharing more as well. You tend to get more candid outcomes. You tend to get more, you know, we know for some reason women don't keep their hands raised as long as men do. So some teachers now will go, they'll just randomly call on people instead of asking for, you know, hands. That same kind of idea around a table. If we have gender parity around a table, then we don't necessarily always have this concern that, oh, maybe I shouldn't speak my mind, or maybe my perspective isn't as valid as someone else's because mine doesn't come from the hard security realm. There's certainly an argument to be made for many of the hard security, the topics, absolutely. But I think it's not a zero-sum game, right? Just because we have those hard security doesn't mean that there isn't a complementary side that says that there are other aspects of security that will enrich the hard security too and make it more effective when we need to use it.
Very interesting. What other ways can we start bringing women in or making the work that women already do more visible?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's certainly the point, is that women are doing things that are valuable, and it's mostly shedding a light on where they are and how that connects to other portions of security. You know, at the end of the day, it's conversations, it's creating the avenues to getting people there, it's creating, like you're saying, parity around tables, it's creating programs that recognize that the lived experiences of women also contributes to ideas of security, that the perspective, you know, as Secretary Clinton had done, you know, ask what is it that's creating that security, you know, that problem for you. Getting that feedback back to people who actually make decisions is a really invaluable tool, but we need to use an interdisciplinary approach. I mean, I guess that would perhaps be the other suggestion, is that the idea is don't just use a security perspective. Don't just think of our old kind of, realist, neo-realist ideas of security or of ideas of how we see the world. Let's use other lenses. Certainly we can put on that lens, right? So we can put on the lens of realist or neo-realist when we need to see hard security issues, to expect that there's going to be balancing or between states. Absolutely, but let's not let that be the only lens that we use. Let's use other lenses. Let's put on a lens that say, what do institutions do? Let's put on a lens that says, what's going on here gender-wise? We put on different lenses, and then we come to a more holistic idea of what security can mean.
All right. Another thing that you had mentioned to me earlier was about the conversation that Anne-Marie Slaughter is sort of bringing to the table. Can you explain to our viewers a little bit more about that?
Well, I think what Anne-Marie...
And first, who she is.
Okay, so Anne-Marie Slaughter she is now in an academic realm, but before that she was in a foreign policy government advisory role, political appointee role, I believe. And what she's suggesting is that access to family, awareness of family issues become national security issues in the way that has not initially been considered. So this idea of bringing more women in, if we prefer to have lots of people around a table with a variety of opinions, then sometimes we need to look at structural issues that are underlining their access to these higher level positions. So that starts to get into more of a social realm, I think, as well, than a foreign policy realm. But certainly the idea is that families, I think one of the phrases she uses, that, families are a foreign policy issue, is this idea of, if you want diversity around the table, that you certainly need to kind of start to think about the reasons why women tend to kind of drop out or drop behind professionally. So that it is a security issue in a way, but I think it's certainly a social issue, and it's not, to be candid, not one that I'm especially familiar with. But we do know that when women are brought in any, to bring it to kind of a macro level, we know that when there's more gender equality, equal opportunity, we know that states are less likely to go to war with each other. We know that that states are less likely to have human rights abuses when there's gender equality. And so when we look at stability, now, of course, the caveat being here, this is correlation, not causation, that we don't know exactly what's driving it, but we know that, when there's gender parity, when there's more equal opportunity, we have economic growth. So we have all these things that all kind of contribute to the same macro goal. And I think Anne-Marie Slaughter's argument is almost it's supportive of that. It comes from that kind of assumption that, the more women we bring in, the more gender parity we have, the better, growth we have. I think it was Bill Gates, right, that said, I think he was asked in Saudi Arabia if someone in the audience asked, can Saudi Arabia achieve, this high-tech growth status, kind of the similar of Silicon Valley, right? And his response was, well, not if you keep 50% of the population from ever participating, right? Forgive me for paraphrasing, but this idea, it's not new, it's not particularly radical. I think it's the idea of bringing everyone in and hoping that when you bring everyone in, or at least you tap into the opportunity, their resources, and give them the opportunity to kind of participate, then, and to suggest that their lived experiences, their definitions of security, their interests are recognized. Once you do that, then you tend to get a much more improved perspective. And so it's not, I think, particularly radical to suggest that looking at everybody's experiences in security tends to make the practice of security and the implementation of security more effective and more cost effective, quite frankly.
Sure. I think that I certainly agree with you on the fact that it's probably not a radical idea, gender equality and gender parity in the West. But what about in Asian cultures where there tend to be some, certain cultures may be less inclusive of women? How do we deal with that?
Sure.
And I realize this is a very challenging
Yeah,
question.
it is, but it's not, yeah. I think 80% of the women in Southeast Asia, or South Asia, I should say specifically, are still in agriculture work. If they're making any money outside of the home, it's in agricultural work.
Okay.
So when we look at employment issues, plus these ideas, but as we were saying before, they don't tend to own the land that they're working on. They don't tend to be able to even sometimes access the market. Certainly, I think of in the Philippines, oftentimes in Mindanao, even just accessing the markets because of conflicts, they're not able to even get where they need to be to have to sell what they've got, and if they do sell it, they might not even be able to keep the money. The idea that their property, that they don't have kind of basic human rights. That tends to be one of the issues that even in Asia we can bring forward. So if you look at 80% of people not, or 80% of women working in agriculture, maybe we're not going to get social rights. We're not going to have, the Swedens of the world, coming out of post-conflict zones in Asia. Practically, that's realistic, right? But the one thing that we can say is if we go with like a basic human rights platform or something like that says, women can't be treated as property, throwing aside the fact that this morally is the right thing to do, economically this makes sense too. I mean, the only people that really stand to lose are the people that tend to benefit from these systems that don't tend to be even, all of the actors in a certain area that tend to perpetuate these cultural ideas. But typically more people stand to gain, men and women, by sending their children to school, by understanding that women should be able to make investments on their own behalf. They should be able to retain some of the money. They should be able to freely, in some cases, walk out of their homes, as radical as that idea might be. So.
I know that you attended a conference recently in Maui, I believe it was in February, with the United States and Japan and Korea. Were you a part of the U.S., Japan, and Korea dialogues at all?
Japan and U.S. dialogue.
The reason that I ask is I'm interested to know if you've had any conversations with your male or female counterparts in other countries, other young leaders, about these sorts of issues. Has that ever come up at all?
Sure, it does. I think initially, it tends to be, the assumption is that it is a zero-sum game. That if women are being taken more seriously, if the experiences of women in conflict zones or their opinions in other realms are taken more seriously, then men will lose. And so sometimes the first thing that I try to do is to establish myself as an interlocutor between the two, to say, I understand the security side, I've seen the military side, I get it. But I also understand that there's a unique opportunity to use these other lenses and to think about unconventional ideas or unconventional approaches, and putting them together tends to create a more intellectually rigorous and cost-effective and sustainable idea of security. So sometimes it's just that initial kind of, I'm not here to tell you I hate you. I'm not here to say that, I think militaries are bad or men are bad or certainly anything like that. Rather, it's this idea of having a joint conversation, because I think oftentimes groups talk past each other. So we have women who oftentimes will organize and highlight women's issues. We have militaries who will come in and they see each other and it's like they want to run in opposite directions. So the idea instead is to sit down and say, well, how do we have dialogues that create candid exchanges where no one comes to the table like hating the other side, but rather we say, okay, well, this makes sense, this, hey, military guy over here, commander so-and-so, here's this idea of, hey, maybe what some of these women are saying is useful, not just in foreign policy or not just in security, but, one of the examples is within militaries themselves. As I'm reminded of another story of, women in Iraq who ended up becoming excessively dehydrated. 2 of them died because what they found out was that they were drinking water during the day, but they had insecurity. They were nervous of their own surroundings, and they were nervous to use the bathrooms at night. So 2 of them died.
Definitely something you would never think about.
Right. So this idea that, the same thing happens on aircraft, right? Women who are pilots, women who are on aircrew, oftentimes if there aren't bathroom facilities, end up being kind of for gender-based reasons, for ideas about kind of what we think of women, don't want to be either using the bathroom or are uncomfortable or are unsafe in their own environment. Sure. They're worried about rape or they're worried about something else. They end up dehydrating. And then they're no longer as effective as soldiers or pilots or aircrew. And so this is not a revolutionary idea, but to get these 2 groups sometimes to sit down to say, oh, wait, but you guys, look, what I have to say can possibly actually supplement your missions. And by the way, some of the women's groups, what the military is doing, there are a lot of wonderful, good people in the military, and we need to, we need to recognize them, and we need to say that, they're not there, just to exist as misogynist individuals or threatening individuals. But weirdly enough, this is a conversation I end up having more than I think that I should. I mean, I was very surprised that, when I started to kind of walk down this line professionally, that it's having these conversations between these 2 groups oftentimes never happens. Or you have to really get people who are senior or secure in their own identities before you can have these conversations. And I think that's getting back to your question about young leaders or young professionals in foreign policy, I think oftentimes we're very concerned about establishing our own bona fides. And when we do that, we don't want to walk outside of these narrow scripts.
Well, Cristin, you have provided so much food for thought for me and our viewers as well. So thank you so much for sitting down with me today. That was a really great program. So I'm Ellise Akazawa. This is Asia in Review. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.